Esteemed audience, welcome to the Great Debaters Contest, where we bring together over 500 schools from all across Kenya to present their ideas. I am your host, Esperantia Kapanga.
And I am Chris Buru. The bone of contention today is developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change than developing countries.
Proposing this motion, we have Josrene's Girls High School.
And opposing this motion, we have Munithu Girls High School.
Proposer number 1, you have 3 minutes.
My name is Primona Kawire from Josrene's Girls, ready to propose a motion that says developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change than the developing countries. First of all, what is climate change? This is the significant and a lasting change in the distribution of weather patterns. What are these patterns? These are wind, temperature, and precipitation. Which are the developed countries? These are the countries that have strong economy. These are the countries that have the thriving economies, countries that have a high income per capita. Which are the developing countries? These are countries that have low economy, countries that are still developing. To my first point is, developed countries have a great obligation to combat this climate change. This is because, for instance, take on their level of education. These are countries that have high level of literacy. You cannot compare them with the developing countries that have low level of education. Look at their education system. These developed countries have these skills. Their education system is basing on their skills on practicals, that they are able to get their skills to navigate, to find the research on the causes of these climatic changes, and hence they are able to combat them. Another thing on the level of education, they have high education level. This is where they are taught how to adapt this climate change, like economically, socially, and even ecologically. Hence, they are able to combat this climate change by adapting methods and ways that are not causing these changes. To my second point is, these developed countries have the responsibility. This is because the countries they can organize themselves. For instance, take like an agency of the United Nations like the UNEP. This agency is formed by countries such as USA, Russia, Britain, and Italy. To my audience, all these countries, are they not from developed countries? Yes, they are. Look at the developing countries. They cannot hold these agencies. This is because they do not have some ways of organizing them, as they are able to combat. But these countries have powers that they can make and organize these agencies, and they are able to combat these climate changes. These agencies are able to teach. They are able to show the ways of combating these changes, and hence they are able to change these climate changes. So I ask my colleague to join me and say that great developed countries have a great obligation to combat this climate change. Thank you.
First proposer, you have 3 minutes to make a statement.
Climate change. What is climate change? This is the longer-term pattern of behaviors of the atmosphere changes. This may be caused due to natural changes or human activities. Ladies and gentlemen, I go by the name Asimwendwa from Munithu Girls High School, and I hereby greatly oppose the motion that states developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change than developing countries. What's the difference between developed countries and developing countries? First, developed countries are countries that have many industries, and yet they have a good economic system. Unlike developing countries, where we have weak industries, where we have to mature up, we have to make up for the time lost during the scientific revolution. They were far ahead of us. And so, many industries, developing states are those that are poor and try to advance the economic system, as I said. On to my first point. Developing countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change than developed countries. Bear me witness when I say that China is a developing country, and as we all know, it has many industries, and up to now, statistics show me that they emit 8% more than the percentage that developed countries emit. For example, why should we always say that because developed countries have many industries, we should say that they all emit very high emissions? Can they do things like textile and those industries? And they don't emit, they don't emit to the percentage that China, yet it's a developing country. So why then do we leave the ball on one side, developed countries? That is like sacrificing someone else for crimes that they did not commit. I rest my case.
Second opposer, you have 3 minutes for rebuttal.
I'm Lucy Modoni from Josrene's Girls High School. I'm here to propose the motion that says developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change than developing countries. In developed countries, there is limited cutting down of trees, and simply because these countries can afford to use the modern methods of cooking, their ways of building houses, they are building permanent houses, and therefore they reduce the cutting down of trees. And as you know, these developing countries, since they are trying to cut down the trees by getting charcoal, they are building materials. So these countries are really using trees. And now you see that the houses that the developed countries are building, since they are permanent, they do not contribute much in cutting down of trees. But the developing countries fully rely on cutting down of trees for charcoal timber, and this releases gases which cause global warming compared to the developed countries. And this reduces the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that affect the global warming. And my second point is that developed countries have a greater threat to the environment, that they are the ones that are contributing more to climate change. This is because these countries, they have many industries, and yet, as you know, industries do release a lot of gases in the atmosphere. And when these gases are released to the atmosphere, they affect the atmosphere, and they cause climate change. Compared to the developing countries, whereby you know they have less industries. These industries, even if they are releasing these gases to the atmosphere, not like the developed countries. And now, these developed countries are the ones that are contributing more to climate change. And my next point is that developed countries have improved technology, whereby they are able to conduct research on how to capture greenhouse gases before they enter to the atmosphere. For instance, developed countries such as the United States, the Germany, and the Sweden have come up with technology to capture methane from landfills and farms. Therefore, I urge my opponent to cross the floor and support me to say that the developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change. Therefore, I rest my case.
Second opposer, you have 3 minutes for your rebuttal.
Developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climatic changes than developing countries. From Munithu Girls High School, I am Renette Mwenda. First of all, to my very learned proposers, I would like to ask you, you said that the developed countries have higher levels of education than the developing countries. I'm not against that, which is very true. But also, put your senses in. The developed countries also have a great level of education. This is because they have a lot of industries. There is no way you can convince me that they have a lot of industries, yet they have a low level of education. I disagree. Then, the second proposer said that the developed countries emit a lot of gases compared to the developing, which is very wrong. Tell us the facts, not what you think. According to the research of 2006 by the environmental agencies,
environmental agencies, they proved that in 2006, China was emitting the highest amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. This was by 8% compared to US. And as we all know, US is a developed country, meaning that it doesn't matter whether a country is developed or developing to produce or emit higher gases. On my point, it doesn't matter whether a country is developed or developing. What only differs here is the level of what they are emitting. And according to my research, I found out that the developing countries and the developed both are emitters, of which China and India, which are developing countries, emit a lot of gases. And for this reason, we should all join hands and fight climatic condition, not leaving the obligation only to the developed countries. And with that, I rest my case.
For the question session, the proposers have been asked, after stating that African or developing countries rather cannot house the offices of different international organizations, are they aware that Nairobi is actually a headquarters for one of the United Nations branches? The opposers, on the other hand, have been asked, what is the role of developing countries in the fight against climate change? Proposer number 3, you have 3 minutes to answer the question.
Sharon Kenya from Josrene's Girls, here to propose the motion that says developed countries have a greater obligation to combat climate change than the developing country. First, I'll start by answering the question that has been asked. Yeah, climate change has been a real threat actually in the world. And now, it's very clear that both the developing countries and the developed countries, they are having the problem of the climate change. But now the question arises, between these two countries, the developed countries and the developing countries, which have a greater obligation to combat these changes. You've asked that, is there no organization that can fight climate changes in Kenya? Yes, or in developing countries, they are there. But this is what we try to mean. Comparing these organizations to when you compare these organizations, maybe the organizations for the developing countries and the organization that my colleague mentions from the developed countries, maybe for instance, these developed countries, they have knowledge on space exploration. Since they have been able to come up with inventions of artificial satellites like the Soviet Union, and as if this is not enough, they have formed organizations like the European Space Agency, the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, the Bern Conference on Climate Change. When you compare these organizations and these organizations for developing countries, these organizations in the developed countries, they have been able to make more research, whereby they have been able to visit the space. So they know what happens there. And as you all know, the best way to solve a problem, first you have to identify the cause. True? Yeah, you have to identify the cause. So when you compare these two organizations for developed countries, they have already visited the space. They know what happens there. This European Space Agency, and they have come with that feeling. That's why the US astronauts, like Scott Kelly, when he visited the space and came to Earth, he said that looking down at our planet from space, it makes one more of an environmentalist. This shows that these people have a feeling. They have already visited that place and they know what happens. So I think they should take the first responsibility. They should have the obligation to combat these climate changes. Yeah, and to my other point, in terms of economic development and financial stability, it is hard to pin down exactly how much developing countries need to curb climate changes. Estimates suggest that it could be as much as 100 billion per year. So, if they need more than 100 billion per year, developing countries, to combat this climate change, and as you know, developing countries, as the name suggests, they are developing. Yeah? They are developing, not yet developed. So, for instance, a country like Kenya, this 100 billion, maybe it's the money that they owe from other countries. Maybe they have borrowed from the developed countries. This is the money that they need. They have borrowed maybe to cope with maybe political instability and other problems. And again, in the developing countries, we have many problems. Embezzlement of funds, corruption. Like in the last year, 900 billion went missing. So these developing countries, they don't even have the means on how they can organize funds and fight climate change. So, my colleagues, please agree with me, join hands with me to conclude that these developed countries have great obligation to combat climate change than developing countries. Thank you.
Third opposer, you have 3 minutes to answer the question.
I go by the name Masin Kata from Munithu Girls, and I'd like to answer the question that was posed to us, the responsibilities of the developing countries. One responsibility they have is to go green, and by going green, I mean they should use the solar energy instead of petroleum, which helps in the global warming. And also, they should use biogas instead of using leaded premium. Yeah. And also, they should also join hands in the Action Climate or SDG number 13, which should help in the coping with the climatic changes in our countries. Setting industrial standards, that is one point. Worldwide, there are countries which are emitting or which are obliged setting industrial standards. Worldwide, countries like Canada and Britain, they have come with an organization that states if a country, for example, like China, as it was said before, China emits more fumes which are harmful to the environment, and USA is a developed country. It produces less. Therefore, how should the developed countries have a great obligation? This states that if you are a country and you emit more fumes, then you are obligated so that you can reduce the amount of fumes that are being emitted. If you emit more, then you have to be obliged more, but not the developed countries. Where were you when they were developing that they should have this obligation of combating climate change? I rest with that.
Proposition, you have 1 minute for your final statement.
My name is Primona Kawire from Josrene's Girls. I would like to propose a motion that says developed countries have a great obligation to combat climate change. Yes, as my fellow has said, they have these ways of, they are the ones that are not emitting more gases to the atmosphere. They are emitting, but these countries have ways of reducing these gases. They have ways of reducing this harmfulness. Hence, they have this responsibility. Since they are the ones that have grown, since they are the ones that have developed and are able to combat these changes. Again, these developed countries have things such as explorations that have helped them. Then, looking at the developing countries, they do not have these things. Should the developed countries keep quiet as the climate is deteriorating and still it's going to affect them as it affects the developing countries? No, they should take the responsibility to combat this change before they affect them. Thank you.
Opposition, you have 1 minute for your final statement.
First of all, to correct you, climatic changes does not only affect the developing countries, but also the developed countries. Again, you think that embracement of funds affects climate change. How? Then, To sum up our points as the opposers, I am strongly opposing this motion. This is because, according to the climate change, the UN nation came up with the solution of coming up with the SDGs. And the SDGs, these are the Sustainable Development Goals, which when we base basically on SDG number 13, it talks about climate change, meaning that we should join hands, go green, and stop climatic changes, since it will not only affect the developed nations, but also the developing. I rest my case.
Both teams, you really did well on the definitions, but maybe you needed to do slightly more because of some of the changes that have been occurring in the recent past. Josrene girls, you were very passionate speakers. You've really brought out, or rather you've combated the motion as, you've given it a fair trial. Munithu girls, you also gave up a very nice definition. You tried giving us some difference between developed and the developing countries, China, and there are many examples that you gave us, especially for the first speaker, that is Mercy. Lynette, that was very good of you. You gave us the examples, and we felt we needed that. However, I still felt you needed a little more. We dealt so much on China. Had you done the research more, and especially as I would go back to the SDGs, you still have gotten a little more. It would have been a little more convincing.
Well, I felt that both teams would have done more. Maybe mention things like clean versus unclean energy, or even explain a little bit about what really causes the climate change. You could maybe have talked about the ozone layer, because we have reports of it's getting depleted. Some scientists are saying that the ozone layer is repairing itself. So I think they've touched more on that. And I believe we studied geography in school, isn't it? Yeah, so we'd have done more on the motion by explaining terms. What really is climate change? Otherwise, you did good. I wish you all the best.
This is Josrene's Primona. You mentioned something about the UNEP, and I think it was cross-examined by someone in the audience. Did you know that UNEP headquarters are actually in Kenya? I think that was the question, because you had said that, these are developed countries are the ones who form these things. So in fact, if the headquarters is here now, that was a very, very cross-examinable point, I may say. But the question to you as a first debater is, why should they have the greater obligation? Okay, probably some of these developed nations are the ones that meet a lot. But maybe that could have been a case that you could have built. For you, Lucy, your role is cross-examination that lacked. And then you mentioned some facts that could be cross-examined. Like you say, developing nations are the ones that fully rely on timber for building. Really, we're not in a timber house now, So some of these statements could have been easily cross-examined. But I think, Sharon, you're very passionate. And I think the audience commended that as well. And we could tell that you really connected. To Munithu girls as well, I think much has been said. But I think for you, the first speaker, you were penalized on your time utilization. For Lynette, cross-examination was well done. I think that was well done. And I think the example of China and India, yes, somebody tried to cross-examine you, but I checked they are still developing nations according to their standard rates. Then you talked about, good facts about China, and you said they were done by environmental agencies. I think you want to go ahead and probably say it's UNEP or something else, okay? Don't just leave it hanging. Mercy, I think you're a very strong pillar as well for your team. I think I love the element on SDGs, and that was good. However, I feel you want to increase some of your pace to maximize on time, all right? Fair enough. All the best.
Our judges have deliberated, and they've decided to award Josrene Girls High School 66%. Let's give them a round of applause. Munithu Girls High School, the judges awarded you 65%, making Josrene Girls High School the winners of this debate. Congratulations to both teams for a job well done.
We would like to appreciate our sponsors, Blazed by Safaricom and Brand Kenya Board, for making this possible. Keep the conversation going on all our social media platforms. The hashtag is GDC for SDGs.
We'd also like to encourage all schools to implement at least one sustainable development goals, not only in your schools, but also your societies, to make Kenya a better place. I have been your host, Chris Boru.
And I am Esperanza Kapanga. Stay tuned.